Meaning and the creative process. How do you find your story's controlling idea? The creative process may begin anywhere. You might be prompted by a premise, a what would happen if, or a bit of character or an image. You might start in the middle, the beginning, near the end. As your fictional world and characters grow, events interlink and the story builds. Then comes that crucial moment when you take the leap and create the story climax. This climax of the last act is a final action that excites and moves you, that feels complete and satisfying. The controlling idea is now at hand. Looking at your ending, ask, as a result of this climatic action, what value, positively or negatively charged, is brought into the world of my protagonist? Next, tracing backward from this climax, digging into the bedrock, ask, what is the chief cause, force, or means by which this value is brought into this world? The sentence you compose from the answers to those two questions becomes your controlling idea. In other words, the story tells you its meaning. You do not dictate meaning to the story. You do not draw action from idea, rather, idea from action. For no matter your inspiration, ultimately, the story embeds its controlling idea within the final climax. And when this event speaks its meaning, you will experience one of the most powerful moments in the writing life, self-recognition. The story climax mirrors your inner self. And if your story is from the very best sources within you, more often than not, you'll be shocked by what you see reflected in it. You may think you're a warm, loving human being until you find yourself writing tales of dark, cynical consequence. Or you may think you're a streetwise guy who's been around the block a few times until you find yourself writing warm, compassionate endings. You think you know who you are, but often you're amazed by what's skulking inside in need of expression. In other words, if a plot works out exactly as you first planned, you're not working loosely enough to give room to your imagination and instincts. Your story should surprise you again and again. Beautiful story design is a combination of the subject found, the imagination at work, and the mind loosely but wisely executing the craft. Idea versus counter-idea. Paddy Chayefsky once told me that when he finally discovered his story's meaning, he'd scratch it out on a scrap of paper and tape it to his typewriter, so that nothing going through the machine wouldn't in one way or another express his central theme. With a clear statement of value plus cause staring him in the eye, he could resist intriguing irrelevancies and concentrate on unifying the telling around the story's core meaning. By one way or another, Chayefsky meant he'd forge the story dynamically, moving it back and forth across the opposing charges of its primary values. His improvisations would be so shaped that sequence after sequence alternately expressed the positive, then negative dimension of his controlling idea. In other words, he fashioned his stories by playing idea against counter-idea. Progressions build by moving dynamically between the positive and negative charges of the values at stake in the story. From the moment of inspiration, you reach into your fictional world in search of a design. You have to build a bridge of story from the opening to the ending, a progression of events that spans from premise to controlling idea. These events echo the contradictory voices of one theme. Sequence by sequence, often scene by scene, the positive idea and its negative counter-idea argue, so to speak, back and forth, creating a dramatized dialectical debate. At climax, one of these two voices wins and becomes the story's controlling idea. To illustrate with the familiar cadences of the crime story, a typical opening sequence expresses the negative counter-idea. Crime pays because the criminals are brilliant and or ruthless, as it dramatizes a crime so enigmatic, Vertigo, or committed by such diabolical criminals, Die Hard, that the audience is stunned. They're going to get away with it! But as a veteran detective discovers a clue left by the fleeing killer, the big sleep, the next sequence contradicts this fear with the positive idea crime doesn't pay because the protagonist is even more brilliant and or ruthless. Then perhaps the cop is misled into suspecting the wrong person. Farewell, my lovely. Crime pays. But soon the protagonist uncovers the real identity of the villain, the fugitive. Crime doesn't pay. Next, the criminal captures, may even seem to kill, the protagonist, RoboCop. Crime pays. But the cop virtually resurrects from the dead, sudden impact, and goes back on the hunt. Crime doesn't pay. The positive and negative assertions of the same idea contest back and forth through the film, building in intensity until, at crisis, they collide head-on in a last impasse. Out of this rises the story climax, in which one or the other idea succeeds. This may be the positive idea. Justice triumphs because the protagonist is tenaciously resourceful and courageous. Bad Day at Black Rock, Speed, The Silence of the Lambs. Or the negative counter idea. Injustice prevails because the antagonist is overwhelmingly ruthless and powerful. 7, Q&A, Chinatown. Whichever of the two is dramatized in the final climatic action becomes the controlling idea of value plus cause, the purest statement of the story's conclusive and decisive meaning. This rhythm of idea versus counter idea is fundamental and essential to our art. It pulses at the heart of all fine stories, no matter how internalized the action. What's more, this simple dynamic can become very complex, subtle, and ironic. In Sea of Love, Detective Keller, Al Pacino, falls in love with his chief suspect, Ellen Barkin. As a result, each scene that points toward her guilt turns with irony. Positive on the value of justice, negative on the value of love. In the maturation plot Shine, Noah Taylor, David's musical victories are positive, but provoke his father's envy and brutal repression, negative. During driving the pianist into a pathological immaturity, doubly negative, which makes his final success a triumph of maturity in both art and spirit. So this is another key component to writing the first blog, wherein you're going to do what's called a value graph, which I'll discuss in a different video. But in any case, a value graph is where you're showing how these turns are happening between the controlling idea and the counter idea. You have this argument going back and forth between the two, and there are specific moments in the plot that allow for these statements to happen, so that something happens moving in a positive direction and where the negative loses, but then it turns around and then the negative wins and then the positive loses, and back and forth, producing aesthetic emotions along the way. Your job is to bring forth what these events are and how the story is structured inside of the effort to sort of prove itself, to prove the controlling idea that's at the heart of the narrative.